The grease never washes out of your fingerprints. You scrub with coarse pumice soap until your knuckles crack open, but the black shadow of the shop always stays buried in the lines of your skin. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my hands under the flickering fluorescent light. They looked like the hands of an old man, mapped with scars and calluses, though I was only 34. My back carried the familiar ache of a 10-hour shift under the hydraulic lift, wrestling rusted struts and heavy engine blocks. The smell of motor oil settles in the back of your throat and refuses to leave. Friday nights do not mean much when you have a mortgage hanging over your head and a 6-year-old boy asleep in the next room. There are no wild nights out, no closing down bars. The house was settling around me, filled with that thick quiet that only arrives after 2 in the morning. The distant wail of a police siren had faded 10 minutes ago, leaving the neighborhood to surrender to the dark. I had a glass of cold tap water, sweating onto the scratched Formica table. The refrigerator hummed a low, steady tune, a mechanical heartbeat in an empty room. I leaned back in the wooden chair and rubbed the back of my neck. My muscles were tight-knotted from days of holding unnatural angles under steel chassis. It was a hard life built on sweat-tight budgets and careful math. I paid for the roof. I kept the heat running. I put food on the plates. I pushed myself up from the table and walked down the short hallway to check on Leo. His bedroom door was cracked open, letting a sliver of yellow hallway light fall across his floor. He was tangled in a mess of superhero blankets, his chest rising and falling in the deep rhythm of childhood. I stood in the doorway for a long time. The room smelled like clean laundry and the faint dust of wooden building blocks. A stuffed bear lay discarded on the rug. This was the center of my world. Every busted knuckle, every missed lunch break was a down payment on his peace of mind. He was oblivious to the grind, the bills, the exhaustion. I stepped inside the room, careful to avoid the loose floorboard near his dresser. I pulled the quilt up over his shoulder and stood listening to his breathing. He mumbled something in his sleep and turned his face into the pillow. I backed out of the room and pulled the door shut, leaving it cracked just an inch. I made my way back toward the kitchen to turn off the overhead light and call it a night. The linoleum felt cold through my socks. That was when the sound broke the silence. It was a dull, heavy thud against the front door. Not the doorbell, just raw knuckles hitting the wood. I stopped in the middle of the room. My eyes found the green digital numbers glowing on the stove clock. 2:14. The silence in the house gathered a sudden heavy weight. Nobody comes to your door at 2:14 in the morning, bringing good news. Midnight knocks only bring tragedy or trouble. I set my empty glass on the counter. The water left a dark ring on the cheap laminate. I walked toward the living room, my steps slow and deliberate on the worn carpet. The street lamp outside cast long, skeletal shadows of the front yard oak tree across the walls. The branches swayed, making the shadows claw at the peeling wallpaper. I kept the living room lights off. You learn to stay in the shadows when the world comes knocking in the dead of night. I reached the front door and put my palm flat against the cold steel frame. I listened. I could hear the wind moving through the dry leaves on the porch, a dry scraping sound like old bones. Then came another knock. This one was softer, lacking the urgency of the first sounding, more like surrender. I leaned forward and pressed my eye to the scratched glass of the peephole. The porch light had burned out days ago. The front steps were bathed in the pale orange glow of the street lamp down the block. A figure stood on my welcome mat. Shoulders hunched, head tipped forward, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a dark canvas jacket. The collar was turned up against the wind. I knew the stance before I saw the face. It was Marcus. We grew up on the same gravel roads, bled on the same high school football fields, and worked side by side in the lumber yard. He was the kind of friend who knew the layout of my kitchen better than his own. We had buried our fathers in the same county cemetery. I threw the deadbolt. The metal clanked loud in the quiet house, echoing down the short hallway. I turned the handle and pulled the door open, letting the damp chill of the late October night wash over my face. Marcus did not look up right away. He stood there staring at the scuffed toes of his work boots. The smell of stale rain and sour whiskey drifted off his clothes. His hair was matted to his forehead with sweat and mist. The cold air rushed past him and into my living room, bringing the scent of wet asphalt and decay. When he finally lifted his head, the street lamp caught his eyes. They were hollow, stripped of the usual fire that kept him moving through life. He looked like a man who had walked 10 miles on broken glass. His jaw was tight, his breathing shallow and ragged. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His hands trembled inside his canvas jacket pockets. A deep bruise was forming along his jawline, dark and angry in the dim light. The wind picked up, rattling the aluminum screen door against its hinges. I stood in the doorway, blocking the warmth of the house. We just looked at each other. 10 years of history hung in the cold air between us. I did not ask him what was wrong. The look on his face answered every question I could have asked. Something inside him had snapped. The foundation had given way. He was not here to share a beer and complain about the foreman. He was here because the road behind him had burned down to ash, and he had nowhere else to stand. I stepped back and pulled the door wider. I did not say a word. I just nodded toward the dark hallway. He crossed the threshold, bringing the bitter scent of the street and wet asphalt with him. The floorboards groaned under his heavy boots. I pushed the door shut against the wind and threw the deadbolt. The metallic click locked the night out, but the cold remained trapped in the entryway. He walked into the living room like a man navigating a minefield. His shoulders stayed rigid, his chin tucked down against his chest. He stopped in front of the worn leather armchair by the window. He did not sit right away. He just stood there staring down at the cracked leather cushions, as if he had forgotten how to rest. I left him standing in the dark and walked into the kitchen. There is a comfort in familiar motions when the world shifts off its axis. I pulled a bag of dark roast from the cabinet. The crinkle of the paper bag sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet house. I measured out 3 heavy scoops into the filter. I did not bother with the overhead light. I worked by the dim green glow of the oven clock. I ran the tap until the water turned ice cold, then filled the reservoir. I hit the power switch. The machine gave a low, mechanical hiss before the water began to bubble and spit. The smell of bitter coffee grounds slowly pushed the scent of stale rain out of the room. I leaned against the laminate counter and crossed my arms, watching him through the archway. He had finally collapsed into the armchair. He sat leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. His hands hung between his legs, clasped together so tight his knuckles were white. The street lamp outside cast a pale stripe of light across his lap, leaving his face in deep shadow. He looked smaller than I remembered. The left sleeve of his canvas jacket was torn at the shoulder, exposing the frayed thermal shirt underneath. Dark patches of grease and dirt stained his denim jeans. The mud on his boots was drying, flaking off onto my cheap carpet. I did not care about the mess. You do not worry about mud when a man is bleeding out in front of you. The coffee pot gave a final wheezing sputter. I reached into the cupboard and pulled down 2 thick ceramic mugs. They were mismatched, chipped at the rims, survivors of a dozen accidental drops in the sink. I poured the coffee black. The steam curled up toward the ceiling, carrying a harsh burnt aroma. I picked up the mugs and walked back into the living room, feeling the floor creak under my weight. I stopped beside his chair and held out the dark blue mug. He did not look up. He just unclasped his hands and reached out to take it. That was when I saw the tremor. His fingers shook so hard the dark liquid sloshed against the rim of the ceramic. He gripped the mug with both hands, trying to force his muscles to obey. It was no use. The violent shaking traveled up his arms, vibrating through his shoulders. I set my mug on the scratched wooden coffee table. I sat down on the edge of the sofa across from him. The springs protested under my weight. I rested my forearms on my knees, mirroring his posture. We sat 3 feet apart, separated by a low table and a chasm of unspoken grief. The silence in the room began to take on a physical shape. It was heavy, pressing down on my chest like a wet wool blanket. Neither of us tried to break it. Some wounds need to breathe before you start digging around in them. The wind outside threw a handful of dead leaves against the window pane. The refrigerator compressor kicked on in the kitchen. In the back bedroom, a floorboard settled with a dull pop. I listened to the sounds of my fragile, quiet life, waiting for him to introduce the chaos of his own. His breathing was jagged. Every inhale sounded like it was being dragged over broken glass. He brought the mug to his mouth, leaning over it to meet the rim halfway. He took a slow, deliberate sip. The heat seemed to ground him, if only for a fraction of a second. He lowered the mug and finally raised his head. The shadow retreated, letting the ambient light catch his face. The bruise along his jaw was shaped like a fist, the edges turning a sickly yellow purple. A thin line of dried blood crusted the corner of his split lip. But the real damage was in his eyes. They were vacant. The stubborn pride that usually anchored him was gone. I was looking at a shell, a structure that had been hollowed out from the inside. He stared past me, fixing his gaze on the blank wall behind the sofa. We had sat in this room 100 times. We had drank cheap beer, argued about football, and complained about the rising cost of lumber. This room held the echoes of easy laughter and shared grievances. Tonight, those echoes were dead. I watched a single bead of sweat track down his temple, cutting a clean line through the grime on his skin. He did not wipe it away. He just sat there anchored to the chair by the crushing weight of whatever he had done. I did not push him. I did not ask the first question. I let the silence stretch until it was pulled taut right to the breaking point. The coffee in my mug stopped steaming, the surface turning still and black. The clock on the wall ticked off the seconds, a steady rhythm against his erratic breathing. The night felt suspended, caught between the disaster that brought him here and the morning that would eventually arrive. He took another shaky breath and closed his eyes. The silence had done its job. It had stripped away the last of his armor, leaving nothing but the raw nerve exposed to the cold air. He set the mug on the floor. The ceramic clicked against the hardwood. He leaned back into the shadows of the armchair and swallowed hard. "Sarah is gone," he said. His voice was cracked rough like sandpaper on rusted iron. The words hung in the air, heavy and jagged. I kept my eyes on him. I did not flinch. I just waited for the rest of the wreckage to surface. She took the girls, packed the station wagon while I was at the site. He rubbed his face with both hands, smearing the dirt across his cheeks. Left the keys to the house on the kitchen island. The ache in my chest tightened. I knew Sarah. I knew the kind of patience she carried, the kind of storm she had weathered with him. For her to leave the keys, the foundation had to be shattered. "What did you do, Marcus?" I asked. My tone was flat, devoid of judgment. He let out a breath that sounded like a dry heave. "I lost it all. The business account, the savings." He stared at the ceiling, blinking against the sting in his eyes. "The supplier raised the prices on the lumber for the new subdivision project. I was bleeding cash. I thought I could fix it." He dropped his gaze to the floor. The shame radiated off him in waves. "I borrowed money from men who don't sign contracts, men who deal in cash and broken bones." I felt a cold knot pull tight in my gut. You do not survive in this town by crossing those lines. You work the extra shifts, you eat the loss, but you do not borrow from the shadows. "I took the money to the underground tables," he whispered. The confession bled out of him, carrying the stench of desperation. "I thought I could double it, pay off the supplier, put the rest back in the safe." He traced the rim of his empty mug with a dirty thumb. "I lost every dime by midnight. $30,000 gone in 3 hours of cards. The numbers hit me like a physical blow. 30,000 was a year of sweat. It was a year of waking up in the dark and coming home with aching joints." "When did she find out?" I asked. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "This afternoon," he said. "The collectors showed up at the house. I wasn't there." My blood ran cold. The thought of those men standing on a front porch with his wife and daughters turned my stomach sour. They banged on the door, shouted my name, told Sarah I had until Monday to square the debt. He squeezed his eyes shut. A tear escaped, cutting a clean path through the grime on his face. She called me at the site. Her voice was shaking. She didn't yell. She didn't curse. She just asked if it was true. He swallowed the lump in his throat. I couldn't lie to her anymore. I told her yes. The room went dead quiet. The refrigerator hummed in the background. The reality of his ruin settled over us like dust. "I drove straight home," he continued. "I broke every speed limit. But I was too late. Well, the closets were empty. The pictures were off the mantel." He looked at me, his eyes wide and hollow. "She didn't even leave a note." I looked at the bruise on his jaw. "Who hit you?" I asked. The anger in my chest was a slow-burning coal. "Her brother," Marcus said. "I went to his place looking for her. He met me in the driveway." He touched the swollen purple flesh along his jawline. He flinched at the contact. He didn't say a word, just threw the punch. I didn't hit him back. I deserved it. He let his hand drop to his side. I laid in the gravel for a long time. He leaned forward, desperate for me to understand the depth of the hole he had dug. "I have nothing left. The bank will take the truck by next month. The business is dead. My family is gone." He buried his face in his hands. The sound of his weeping was terrible, a raw animal noise torn from the bottom of his chest. I sat there and listened to a man break apart. There was no comfort to offer. Platitudes are useless when a man sets his own house on fire. I thought about my own son sleeping in the next room. I thought about the fragile thread that holds a life together. One bad decision, one moment of weakness, and the thread snaps. Marcus was a good man who made a fatal error. He let the pressure of providing turn him reckless. The weight of the world had crushed his judgment. "I can't go back," he sobbed. The words were muffled against his palms. There is nothing to go back to. He was right. The life he knew was ash. The man who woke up this morning was dead, replaced by the ghost sitting in my living room. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was no longer expectant. It was the silence of a graveyard after the dirt is shoveled in. He kept his face buried in his calloused hands. His shoulders heaved with quiet, agonizing sobs, the kind of crying that tears muscles and leaves a man empty. I did not offer him a tissue. I did not tell him it was going to be all right. Lying to a drowning man does not help him swim. He had traded his entire universe for a seat at a folding table in a smoke-filled room. He had chased a phantom solution and caught a nightmare. The men he owed did not care about apologies. They cared about the 30,000. They cared about setting an example. His nightmare was just beginning to unfold. "They took my tools too," he mumbled through his fingers. When I got back to the site, my truck boxes were pried open. Saws, drills, compressors, all gone. That detail twisted the knife. A craftsman without his tools is a soldier without a rifle. They had stripped him of his only means to climb out of the pit. "It was a down payment on the debt," he said. He finally lowered his hands. His eyes were bloodshot, the skin underneath bruised with exhaustion. "I have 48 hours to find the rest. Or they come back. And this time, they won't just talk." The stakes were laid bare on my living room floor. He was not just a broken man. He was a hunted one. I stared at the black coffee in my mug. The reflection on the surface was murky and distorted, just like the road ahead of him. The words hung in the stale air of my living room. 48 hours. The numbers echoed like a death sentence. I looked at Marcus. I saw past the bruised jaw and the dirt-stained canvas jacket. I saw a man free-falling through the dark without a parachute. I knew the wind of that fall. I knew the temperature of the terror gripping his chest. It was the same cold panic that built a home in my own ribs 4 years ago. My mind drifted away from the worn sofa. It pulled me backward, dragging me down the hallway of my own past. It took me back to a winter that almost buried me alive. Leo was 2 years old. His mother had packed her bags on a Tuesday afternoon while it sleeted outside. She left her wedding band on the bathroom sink and walked out the door without looking back. The silence she left behind was heavy enough to break floorboards. I remember standing in our cramped, freezing apartment holding a crying toddler. The heating bill was 3 months past due. I had $14 in my checking account. My pride was a worthless currency. I was a father, a provider, and I had nothing to provide. I remember the physical ache of that failure. It started in the throat and spread down into the stomach, a hollow, gnawing sickness. You look in the mirror and you do not see a man. You see a fraud. You see a pair of empty hands that cannot build a shelter for the people who depend on them. That is the mirror Marcus was staring into right now. I remember wrapping Leo in 3 layers of sweaters just to put him to bed. I sat on the floor beside his crib with a blanket over my shoulders. I watched his breath form tiny white clouds in the freezing room. I did not sleep that night. I stayed awake negotiating with God, making promises I had no collateral to back up. I begged for a way out of the hole I had dug through stubborn pride and bad math. The next morning, I sold my own tools. I pawned the socket set my grandfather gave me. I handed over my heavy-duty air compressor for a fraction of what it was worth. I took the cash and bought groceries. I paid the gas company just enough to turn the heat back on. I swallowed the bitter ash of defeat so my son could stay warm. I did not lose my money at a card table like Marcus. My ruin came from a slow leak, 1,000 small failures, and medical bills that bled us dry. But the destination was the same. We both ended up at the bottom of the same dark well. We both felt the crushing weight of failing the people who looked up to us. The method of destruction did not matter. The rubble looked identical. I watched Marcus trace the rim of his empty mug again. His hands were still trembling, betraying the panic he was trying to choke down. He was waiting for me to judge him. He was bracing for the lecture, the righteous anger of a man who kept his own house in order. He thought I was going to throw stones from a high tower. He forgot where I came from. He forgot that I built this quiet, stable life on top of a graveyard of my own mistakes. I knew what it cost to buy back your soul. You think you were the first man to burn his life to the ground, I said. My voice was low, cutting through the hum of the refrigerator. You think you own the patent on failure. Marcus flinched. He kept his eyes glued to the scuffed toes of his boots. He did not have the strength to defend himself. Look at me, I said. I waited until he forced his head up. His eyes were red-rimmed and swimming with exhaustion. 4 years ago, I fed my son watered-down milk because I couldn't afford a full gallon. I dodged the landlord for a month. I scavenged aluminum cans from construction sites just to buy bread. I let the words land. I watched the surprise flicker across his bruised face. I was handing him my own shame, laying it out on the table beside his. I stood on the edge of the bridge on Route 9 for 2 hours one night. I looked down at the black water and calculated the math of a life insurance payout. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees. I know the math, Marcus. I saw the tension in his jaw slacken just a fraction. The isolation was breaking. He was not alone in the dark anymore. The difference is I didn't jump, and I didn't run, I told him. I walked away from the edge, I went home, and I started sweeping up the glass. It is a brutal, agonizing process. You cut your hands on the jagged edges of your own ruined choices. You bleed and you keep sweeping. You accept that the house you built is gone. You stop mourning the walls and you start looking at the dirt underneath. You figure out what kind of foundation you have left. Marcus was still suffocating in the smoke of his burning life. He was fixated on the flames, paralyzed by the heat. He needed to understand that the fire was already over. There was nothing left to save. The lumber was ash. The only thing left to do was figure out how to survive the morning. I did not offer him a way out of the debt. I did not have $30,000. I could not fight the men coming to collect. But I could stand in the ashes with him. I could show him the scars on my own hands. I could prove that a man can survive the end of his world. The wind outside picked up again, rattling the window pane. Inside, the heavy, suffocating silence had shifted. It was no longer the silence of the grave, but the quiet of a shared trench. He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the empty mug resting on the floorboards. If I can just talk to her. If I can just get Sarah on the phone. I leaned back against the worn sofa cushions. The old springs groaned under my weight, a harsh sound in the quiet room. She is not going to answer Marcus. He looked up, a flash of desperate anger cutting through his exhaustion. You don't know that. We have been married 12 years. I held his gaze. I did not raise my voice or soften my tone. She left the keys on the island. A woman who wants to be found does not leave the keys. The fight drained out of him as fast as it arrived. His shoulders slumped forward again. The street lamp cast a long skeletal shadow across his face. He wanted a loophole. He wanted a magical sequence of words to undo the wreckage of the last 24 hours. He was begging for a time machine that did not exist. You are looking backward, I told him. You are staring at a house that has already burned to the ground. You cannot live in the ashes. He rubbed the back of his neck, his fingers digging into the grime and sweat. Then what do I do? How do I fix this? You don't fix it, I said. The words were heavy, dropping between us like stones. You cannot glue this back together. The frame is shattered. He let out a ragged breath. The realization was suffocating him. He was a builder. A man who spent his life measuring twice and cutting once to create something solid. Now he had to accept that his own hands had torn the structure down. The men I owe, he whispered, they will come back. They promised they would. I nodded. They will. Men like that do not forgive a debt, and they do not renegotiate terms. He looked at his hands. They were bruised, the knuckles swollen and raw from days of labor and a night of despair. I don't have the money. I don't even have my tools to earn a dime. You have a truck, I said. You have a house with equity. You have a plot of land your father left you out on County Road 9. His head snapped up. His eyes widened with shock. My father's land. That is the only thing I have left of him. I was going to build a cabin there for the girls. I let the silence hang for a moment. I needed him to hear the echo of his own voice. I needed him to understand the gravity of his situation. The girls are gone, Marcus, I said. The dream of the cabin is gone. You traded it for a seat at an underground table. He closed his eyes. A fresh tear tracked through the dirt on his cheek. The pain of the truth was tearing him apart from the inside. You sell the land, I told him. You sell the truck. You call a broker in the morning and you take whatever cash they offer for the house. He shook his head, a slow mechanical movement. I will have nothing. I will be on the street. You will be alive, I fired back. My voice held a hard edge now. You will be breathing, and your wife and daughters will be safe from the men you brought to their doorstep. He stared at me, the horror of the choice settling deep in his bones. It was a brutal math. He had to sever his own limbs to save his life. If you try to run, they will find you, I said. And if they cannot find you, they will look for the people you left behind. You know the rules of this game. He knew. The underground did not operate on sympathy. They operated on leverage, fear, and broken bones. Tomorrow morning, you start making calls, I instructed. You liquidate every piece of your life. You gather the 30,000 and you hand it over. He dropped his face into his hands again. The sound of his breathing was jagged and wet. He was mourning the death of his future. And after that, he asked. His voice was muffled against his palms. What happens on Monday when the debt is paid and my pockets are empty? You wake up, I said. You put your boots on. You walk to a job site and you ask for a shovel. I stood up from the sofa. My knees popped in the cold air. I walked over to the window and looked out at the empty street. The oak tree in the front yard swayed in the wind. The dead leaves scraped across the asphalt. The world outside was indifferent to the tragedy unfolding in my living room. You start over? I said, keeping my eyes on the dark street. You take the minimum wage. You eat cheap food. You sleep on a rented mattress. I turned back to look at him. He was watching me, his eyes hollow but listening. The panic was receding, replaced by a cold, grim acceptance. You earn back your sweat 1 hour at a time, I told him. You pay child support on time every month. You do not ask for forgiveness because you have not earned it yet. He swallowed hard. The muscle in his jaw twitched. The illusion of a quick fix was dead and buried. It will take years, he whispered. The reality of the timeline was crushing. I will be an old man before I can stand on my own 2 feet again. Maybe, I agreed, but you will be a man who paid his debts. You will be a man who did not let his daughters pay for his sins. I walked back to the kitchen to dump the cold coffee in the sink. The dark liquid spiraled down the drain. It was a bitter medicine, but it was the only cure I had to offer. There was no comfort here. There was only the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth. He had to walk through the fire he set, and he had to do it alone. You don't get to skip to the end, I said, walking back into the living room. You don't get to fast forward through the pain. You have to feel every single step of the climb. He nodded slowly. He understood. The debt was not just financial, it was a debt to his own soul. I will make the calls, he said. The gravel in his voice was firming up. First thing in the morning, I will sell the land. The words cost him everything. I could see the grief in his eyes, but I could also see the resolve taking root. You can sleep on the couch tonight, I told him. Tomorrow the work begins. The sky did not offer a dramatic sunrise. It just bled from pitch black to a bruised iron gray. The pale light crept through the gaps in the living room blinds, tracing thin lines across the worn carpet. Marcus had not slept. He sat on the edge of the sofa, with his forearms resting on his knees. His silhouette was sharp against the pale window, a statue carved out of exhaustion. The furnace kicked on, blowing dry air through the floor vents. The sound seemed to pull him out of his trance. He stood up, his joints popping in the quiet room. He did not look like the man who had knocked on my door hours ago. The frantic, hunted animal in his eyes was gone. What replaced it was a cold, heavy resignation. He was a man walking to the gallows of his own making, but at least he was walking. He picked up his canvas jacket from the armrest. The fabric was stiff with dried mud and grease. He slid his arms into the sleeves and pulled the collar up against his neck. He spent a long time looking at his boots. "The broker opens at 8, he said. His voice was a dry rasp, stripped of all emotion. I'll be sitting in his parking lot when he unlocks the door. Then I make the call on the truck. I stood by the kitchen archway and nodded. Get the cash, pay the men. Do not hesitate. He walked toward the front door. His boots sounded heavy on the linoleum, carrying the weight of the next 10 years. He stopped with his hand on the brass deadbolt. He looked back at me. There was no need for a long goodbye or a fragile promise. We both knew the brutal road waiting for him on the other side of the wood. "Thank you," he said. It was barely a whisper. It was the only currency he had left to offer. "Leave the keys on the counter if you need a place to sleep tonight," I told him. "The couch is yours, nothing else." He gave a slow nod, turned the deadbolt, and opened the door. The morning air rushed in sharp and smelling of frost and wet pine. He stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind him. The latch clicked into place. I walked over to the window and moved the blind with 2 fingers. I watched him walk down the cracked concrete driveway. His shoulders were still hunched, but his stride was even. He climbed into his beat-up truck, the one he would hand over to a stranger by noon. The engine turned over with a rough cough before settling into a steady idle. He backed out into the street and drove away. The red taillights faded into the gray morning mist. The neighborhood was quiet again, returning to the simple rhythm of a Saturday morning. I let the blinds snap back into place. The house felt huge and empty. The lingering smell of stale coffee and damp canvas was the only proof he had been here at all. I walked down the short hallway toward the back bedroom. My legs felt heavy carrying the phantom ache of a sleepless night. I stopped at Leo's door and pushed it open just enough to slip inside. The room was warm. The small nightlight in the corner cast a gentle blue glow over the walls. Leo was curled up on his side, his face half buried in the pillow. His breathing was a soft, rhythmic metronome. I stood at the foot of his bed and watched his chest rise and fall. He was safe. He was warm. I looked down at my hands. The grease stains were still there, worked deep into the creases of my palms. They were the hands of a man holding onto the edge of a cliff, refusing to let go. We are all standing on that same edge. We build our lives on top of fault lines, pretending the ground is solid. We tell ourselves that ruin is something that happens to other men in other towns. But the truth is much colder. It only takes one bad pivot, one moment of weakness in the dark to bring the whole structure down. Marcus was not a monster. He was just a man who forgot the weight of the roof he was carrying. He let his pride rewrite his common sense. He gambled his foundation for a shortcut that did not exist. Now he had to pay the toll. The world does not offer grace to men who gamble with the safety of their children. The world demands blood and sweat and years of silent labor to balance the scales. I pulled the quilt up over Leo's shoulders. My knuckles brushed against the soft cotton of his pajamas. This fragile piece was bought and paid for with discipline. It is the quiet, unglamorous work of saying no to the shortcuts. It is the grit required to wake up in the cold, go to the job you hate, and pay the bills on time. There are no medals awarded for simply doing what you are supposed to do. The reward is the silence of a safe house at dawn. The reward is knowing the men in the shadows have no reason to knock on your door. You do not survive this life by being lucky. You survive it by being steady. I walked out of the room and left the door cracked. The sun was finally clearing the horizon, painting the living room walls in a harsh, unforgiving light. The day was here, demanding to be lived. If you are listening to this, maybe you know the weight of that morning sun. Maybe you have sat in the ashes of your own choices and wondered how to rebuild the frame. Or maybe you were the one holding the door open for a friend who lost his way. There is a quiet brotherhood in the struggle to keep the walls standing. We carry the scars of our failures hidden beneath work shirts and calloused hands. But those scars are the map of our survival. If you have a story of starting over, of sweeping up the glass when everyone else walked away, leave it in the comments below. Let this be a place where the hard truths are spoken and shared. Share your grit. And if this story resonated with the beat of your own life, consider subscribing to Vintage Heartbeats. We are all just trying to keep the cold out. Until next time, keep your hands steady and your foundation strong.